Member of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much,
Leaders.
Madam Chair. I am pleased to rise in support of this amendment. However, I will enumerate reasons for which I believe it is inadequate, and therefore it is my intention to propose a sub-amendment should this one be adopted by the committee. Madam Chair, first I'd like to review how we got here. Last April, my colleague, the Deputy Leader of the United Conservative Party, the Member of the Legislative Assembly for Rocky View, Chestermere, raised for the first time, was the first member to raise in this place, the concern about physicians who have been found culpable of various forms of sexual assault against patients or indeed colleagues. And in fact, my colleague raised this on April 19th of this year. And shortly thereafter, I raised a question in this chamber about the practice of the College of Physicians allowing a license to practice to member physicians who had been found guilty of sexual assault. We all know the particular case which led to this, which seemed to us a prima facie abuse of the regulatory authority of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, an authority granted to it by this Assembly on behalf of Albertans. How much time do I have?
20 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you. Sorry, I'm still learning the rules around here, Madam Chair. Thank you for your patience. Madam Chair, I think it's very important for us to underscore that regulatory bodies, professional licensing agencies designated by the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, while they are self-governing agencies, they are accountable to and ultimately derived their authority from this place, acting on behalf of Albertans. And they therefore do not have carte blanche to abuse their regulatory authority in such a flagrant way as to grant a license to practice medicine to predator doctors. This, I think, is a matter, quite frankly, of common sense. I think this is a question that transcends partisan or ideological views, Madam Chair. This is about, in part, the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. It is about the vulnerability of patients who enter into that relationship, trusting implicitly that the physicians treating them will act as conscientious professionals, respecting their personal, physical and sexual integrity. And so when a physician violates that trust in such a flagrant way as to sexually assault or abuse a patient, it is, I believe, essentially an unforgivable crime in terms of their professional credentials. Of course, Madam Chair, it may also, such instances may also be subject to criminal sanction under the Criminal Code of Canada. And they may also be subject to professional censure. But the question before us now, a question that the official opposition raised in this place 6 months ago, is whether a slap on the wrist is adequate as a sanction by the licensing body to discipline a member who has sexually abused a patient. And that is why last spring, Madam Chair, I called on the government to bring forward legislation to deal with this. Now, when I first did so, the Honourable Minister of Health said essentially that the college didn't have the power to withhold licenses. And so I said, well, I said right on the spot, well then, Madam Chair, why don't we amend the relevant legislation to grant the college the power to withhold permanently the right to practice from predator doctors. And I indicated to the Honourable the Minister and the government that we in the opposition would be keen to cooperate in any way with the government in the development or passage of such legislation swiftly. And we were quite frankly prepared to do that last spring. And to fast-track legislation of that nature. Well, it's unfortunate it took the government so long to act, but finally they came forward with legislation now. And it clearly wasn't a priority in the spring. So they finally came forward with legislation. But even though this matter had initially been raised by the opposition in a completely constructive and nonpartisan fashion with a polite offer of cooperation, the government did not consult with the opposition prior to the introduction of the bill. When concerns were then raised by the opposition about the legislation, about its ability, about it allowing for the predator doctors to have their licenses renewed, Madam Chair, the government dismissed these concerns out of hand and voted against 3 opposition amendments to allow for a long-term or effective life ban on predator doctors from practicing medicine. And so, Madam Chair, I want to dial back, though, if somebody could find me the answer to my question period exchange with the minister. What I found really problematic, and this is what I want to, I'll get back to the substance of the issue in a second, but I want to talk about the process that led us to this peculiar moment this morning of the government furiously backpedaling in embarrassment over its mishandling of this important issue. Madam Chair, when I rose in this place in the spring to ask the minister about this issue, I did so in the most polite, respectful way possible. And the Honourable Minister responded with a partisan and personal attack. A partisan and personal attack, as the Hansard transcript will confirm. And Madam Chair, I think that's exactly the problem that led us to this place. A spirit of hyper-partisanship that we see from this government in general, and quite frankly, from this minister in particular. So let me share with you the exchange that we had, Madam Chair. I'm looking for last March, not yesterday. So, Madam Chair, here you have a serious issue affecting vulnerable women in particular, a good faith effort on part of the opposition to reach across the aisle to the government. I thanked the minister in advance for any cooperation we could have on this issue. I offered in a nonpartisan way to cooperate, and her response was a partisan and personal attack. Madam Chair, the refusal to even contemplate operating in good faith with the opposition is what led us to this embarrassing moment today. And I would like to propose to the government that it consider this a learning moment. That perhaps, Madam Chair, perhaps there is not a Manichaean kind of duality here where the government is all good and the opposition is all bad. Perhaps the government could admit, in the wake of this fiasco, this legislative fiasco, that perhaps elected members of the opposition, at least on occasion, are acting in good faith and can be constructive legislative partners in finding solutions for Albertans. Madam Chair, this points to a larger issue. When I had the honour of becoming leader of the opposition, I met with my colleagues in this caucus and said that I think Albertans expect us to raise the bar of decorum and civility in this place. When I first visited the Assembly shortly after being elected leader, but before being elected member of this place, I couldn't believe the disrespectful noise back and forth, the desk thumping, the heckling, the unnecessary insults, and quite frankly, from both sides, Madam Chair. And I understand why that happens. I've got a little bit of parliamentary experience, and I, in my 19 years in the federal parliament, would see when hyper-partisanship would take over, and mea maxima culpa, Madam Chair, undoubtedly many times in those 19 years I was responsible for it. Didn't make me proud. In fact, perhaps as I matured, Madam Chair, it made me learn that politics, at least in a deliberative chamber such as this, could be done differently. It is important that this is a place for the clash of ideas. It is inevitable and desirable that we should have vigorous debates, disagreeing vigorously on policy issues. That's how this great Westminster parliamentary democratic system ought to be. But surely undergirding that should be a basic respect for one another that I think has been frankly devoid in this chamber. When I hear the kind of insults, I mean, it is not, I'm sorry to raise this, but I'm going to, Madam Chair. I don't think it's a coincidence that the minister who walked herself into this problem in part by her refusal to even sit down and talk to the opposition or seriously to consider opposition amendments is the minister who stood up in this place and said that members of my party, quotes, hang out with sewer rats. That kind of, and I appreciate the member apologized for that. But Madam Chair, I raise this for a point. The tendency to go to that kind of rhetorical extreme in demonizing your opposition is what leads to a failure to cooperate in a spirit of civility and nonpartisanship on certain issues like this, issues that ought to transcend partisanship. Now, I am a partisan, Madam Chair. I hope that my party wins the confidence of Albertans next year. We're going to have a strong debate in the election and the time leading up to it. But surely there are moments when we can park the partisanship. And so I raise this because I really do hope this will be a learning moment about the importance of cooperation when it is possible. I think that's all Albertans expect of us. They don't want this chamber to be an echo chamber. They don't expect us all to be of like mind on everything all of the time. And they understand that spirits will get high occasionally. I get that. And none of us are angels, Madam Chair. But when there is an honest, good faith effort to reach out, perhaps we could accept that. Let me share this with you in the context of my own parliamentary experience. When I had the honor of serving as a minister of the federal crown, I made it a point to reach out to my opposition shadow ministers or critics, to consult with them on legislation before it was drafted and after it was introduced. In fact, Madam Chair, I believe if you check with my former opposition shadow ministers, they will confirm this, including the Right Honourable the Prime Minister, who was my critic for 3 years.
That's right.
And including somebody I consider a dear friend, a New Democrat, Olivia Chow. She once said, she was my critic for 3 years, and she will confirm, if asked, Madam Chair, that I, on multiple cases, accepted a number of NDP amendments to Conservative government bills that I introduced. And I'll go a step further, Madam Chair, and I will reveal that my boss, the Prime Minister, didn't like me coming back to Cabinet to seek approval to amend government legislation to accept opposition amendments. He wasn't really big on that idea. But Madam Chair, I thought it was critically important that to the greatest extent possible, we tried to find common ground. If we couldn't find complete consensus, that we at least listen to one another.
Which you can live with.
I spent dozens of hours as a federal minister sitting down with my counterparts in the opposition parties, including the NDP, to try to find common ground. And so, now I'm sure those opposition critics will say I didn't do it enough because I didn't accept all the opposition amendments. I didn't agree with them all of the time. But they will absolutely confirm that I tried to reach out and often did accept their amendments in good faith. So if I could do that with the NDP in opposition in the House of Commons, why can't this NDP government do it with the Conservative opposition in this legislature? Madam Chair, is that an unreasonable thing to suggest?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Now, Madam Chair, I have this now, this May 2nd, 2018, in Hansard. I said, I thank the Honourable, so I asked the Honourable Minister of Health, I'm going to quote this into the record, can the Minister clarify whether or not the College of Physicians has agreed that they will withdraw licenses to practice from physicians who are charged with sexual assault or are under investigation for that kind of terrible crime? The Minister said, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some governments are further ahead of us in their work in this regard. We're definitely working in close partnership to make sure that all Alberta women can feel safe when they're going to the doctor. I replied, May the 2nd, quotes, I thank the honourable member for the substantive answer. Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister is telling us that the College will not do this unilaterally, but it requires legislation. Why could the College not take its own disciplinary action to withhold licenses from physicians accused of sexual assault? Secondly, I can assure the Minister that we would cooperate with the expeditious passage of any legislation granting the College that power. And the Minister replied saying, which quotes, I'm excited to hear that the member is willing to show up and vote on a bill that is certainly important to women accessing health care services. It's good to hear that the member of the official opposition plans on showing up in this regard. I've heard the quote that 90% of success is about showing up. As an Alberta woman, I'm concerned about what the track record of that member has been, but I'm glad he plans on showing up for this vote. There's only one way I could characterize that response, which is snark, Madam Chair. A snarky, partisan response in answer from the Deputy Premier of Alberta in response to a completely nonpartisan expression of gratitude and offer of cooperation. And so, Madam Chair, that's the attitude which caused the Minister not to sit down with my colleague or other opposition members to discuss the statutory solution to the loophole allowing predator doctors to get their licenses to practice. That's the attitude, the hyper-partisan effort to demonize other members of this place, which caused the government and the Minister to dismiss out of hand 3 thoughtful and constructive amendments brought forward by opposition members. So again, I hope that this will, there's not a lot of time left in this legislature, a few more months, but hopefully in those few months, as partisan tempers rise, inevitably we get closer to an election, how about in this place we make a conscientious effort to find common ground? In that spirit, Madam Chair, I thank the government. I thank the Honourable the Minister of Health for having reconsidered this issue. 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
You started that clock a minute later.
Oh, I see that. I thank the government and the Minister for having reconsidered this matter. I thank them for the motion that they have brought forward. I'm glad that they now have had a change of mind and agree with us in principle that the consequence of the abuse of practice by predator doctors should be potentially a permanent ban on their ability to potentially victimize other patients. And I look forward to speaking a little bit more on the substance of this amendment later in the debate. Thank you, Madam Chair.